In the final weeks of the war, as Germany's front lines collapsed and American forces raced east, the city of Kassel became an unlikely last stronghold. It was not a fortress by design, but a place of industry, home to the Henschel works, where some of the last King Tiger tanks were built and repaired. When elements of George S. Patton's Third Army approached the city in early April 1945, they did not just face scattered infantry or fleeing columns. They ran into a pocket of heavy armor crews, mechanics, trainees, and remnants of armored units who chose to fight where they stood, surrounded by factories, rail yards, and ruined streets. What followed was not a set-piece battle recorded in textbooks, but a brutal, short, and uneven confrontation, American infantry and armor pushing into an industrial city against a handful of Tiger II tanks that were never meant to fight alone, never meant to die in workshops and streets. Cut off, short on fuel, ammunition, and any hope of relief, the defenders launched local counterattacks, ambushes, and desperate moves that bordered on the suicidal. Most of these tanks would never escape Kassel. This is not a story of victory or strategy. It is the full story of how the last King Tigers at Kassel fought and were lost, facing Patton's army in a battle that remains largely unknown. A final, futile stand of steel against an enemy that could no longer be stopped. Kassel sits about 140 kilometers northeast of Frankfurt in the state of Hesse. Before the war, 200,000 people lived there. It was an industrial hub, home to the Henschel works, a sprawling complex that had churned out locomotives, trucks, and since 1942, Tiger tanks. By March 1945, the city was a ruin. The RAF had flattened the medieval centre back in October 1943. Whole neighbourhoods were just rubble and ash. People lived in cellars. Water came from wells. Electricity worked sometimes, in some districts if you were lucky. The October 1943 raid had been particularly devastating. On the night of October 22nd, RAF Bomber Command dispatched 569 aircraft over Kassel, 443 Lancasters, 10 Mosquitoes, and the rest Halifaxes. They dropped incendiaries and high explosives in a carefully planned pattern designed to create a firestorm. The attack worked exactly as intended. Fires merged into a single massive conflagration that consumed the city centre. Temperatures reached 1,000 degrees. People suffocated in their shelters as the fire sucked oxygen from the air. Others were incinerated trying to flee. 10,000 civilians died that night. The medieval old town, centuries of German architecture, was erased in under 2 hours. After that came more raids, smaller ones, more focused. The Henschel plant was hit repeatedly, so were the railway yards, the marshalling stations, the bridges. By early 1945, Kassel looked like photographs of Stalingrad, entire blocks reduced to skeletal walls and mountains of brick, streets buried under debris, the smell of decay everywhere because bodies still lay buried in collapsed buildings. But the Henschel plant, it kept producing. Through more than 40 bombing raids, the workers kept the assembly lines moving. Sections of the factory had been destroyed and rebuilt. Parts of production had moved underground. Shifts ran around the clock. Every Tiger that came out might be the last. And in late March, that became literally true. The Tiger II was the pinnacle of German tank design and also its death spiral. Picture a tank so heavy, so over-engineered that it could barely move. 69 tons of steel and armour. An 88mm main gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges beyond 2,000 meters. Frontal armor so thick, 150mm sloped at 50 degrees, that nothing the Americans or British had could penetrate it head-on. Sounds unstoppable, right? Except the Tiger II was a mechanical nightmare. The engine, designed for the much lighter Panther tank, groaned under the weight. The Maybach power plant put out 700 horsepower, which sounds impressive until you realize the tank weighed 69 tons. That's barely 10 horsepower per ton. A Sherman had 15. The Tiger II accelerated like a loaded freight train and handled about as well. Fuel consumption was catastrophic, roughly 2 liters per kilometer on roads, worse in combat. Cross-country movement could burn 3 or even 4 litres per kilometre. The fuel tanks held 860 litres total. Do the math. Maximum road range was maybe 170 kilometres under ideal conditions. In combat, with manoeuvring, stops and starts, defensive positions, cut that in half. The Tiger II couldn't operate without constant fuel resupply, and by March 1945, Germany didn't have fuel to resupply anything. Transmissions failed constantly. The Maybach gearbox was a precision instrument designed for careful use. Put it under combat stress, especially with inexperienced drivers, and it broke. The final drive units, the gears that turned the tracks, broke under stress. German engineers had warned about this during development. The drives were rated for a Panther's weight, not a Tiger II's, but production pressures meant the design went forward anyway. Crews learned to baby the controls, to shift carefully, to avoid sharp turns. That works fine in peacetime. In combat, it gets you killed. Track links wore out fast. The steel tracks, each link weighing dozens of kilograms, would stretch and break under the vehicle's weight. Replacing them required jacks, tools, and hours of work. The whole machine needed constant maintenance, the kind of careful, expert upkeep that didn't exist anymore in March 1945. Only 492 Tiger IIs were ever built between January 1944 and March 1945. Production peaked at 70 units per month, but usually ran lower due to bombing disruption and component shortages. The last 8 came out of Kassel in late March with factory-fresh paint and were immediately handed over to teenage boys who had never been in combat. These kids came from the 3rd Company of the 511th Heavy Tank Battalion. Most were 17 or 18 years old. A few were 19, old men by the standards of March 1945. They'd had basic training, maybe a week or 2 on the Tiger II if they were lucky. The curriculum was rushed. Learn to start the engine, learn to shift gears, learn to load the main gun, learn to read a map. That was it. No gunnery practice because there was no ammunition to waste. No cross-country manoeuvres because there was no fuel. No combined arms training with infantry because there was no time. The veteran tankers who could have trained them properly, dead on the Eastern Front, captured in France, scattered across a collapsing Reich with no tanks to command. The 3rd Company's table of organisation called for 14 Tiger IIs and trained crews to man them. Instead, they got 8 tanks, green crews, and orders to deploy immediately. So these boys climbed into the most advanced heavy tanks in the world and prepared to fight one of the most experienced armies on Earth. Meanwhile, Patton was coming. Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army had punched through the Rhine on March 22nd at Oppenheim, south of Mainz. The crossing caught the Germans by surprise. Patton's engineers threw pontoon bridges across the river in record time. By the morning of March 23rd, entire divisions were streaming across. His orders from General Omar Bradley were clear. Drive east, secure the southern flank of First Army's push toward the Ruhr. Don't let the Germans reinforce their trapped armies. Move fast. Patton didn't need to be told twice. Speed was his religion. He pushed his corps commanders relentlessly. Bypass strong points. Ignore your flanks. Keep moving. The Germans are beaten, he told them. Act like it. His staff worked around the clock, coordinating fuel shipments, ammunition resupply, maintenance schedules. The Third Army consumed staggering quantities of supplies. Gasoline, diesel, food, ammunition, spare parts. All of it had to be trucked forward from depots hundreds of kilometers to the rear. By March 26th, Patton's spearheads had reached Frankfurt. The ancient city on the main river, Germany's financial capital, fell with barely a fight. The German defenders were a joke. Replacement units, training battalions, old men and boys. They had rifles, maybe some machine guns, and no heavy weapons, no armor, no artillery worth mentioning. Most didn't even have proper uniforms. Some wore civilian clothes with military caps. Others had parts of uniforms mixed with civilian items. They looked like what they were, desperate improvisations. The Americans just rolled over them. Resistance varied wildly. Some German units fought hard from prepared positions, inflicting casualties before being overrun or bypassed. Others surrendered at the first sight of American tanks. Some commanders ordered their men to hold to the last round. Others quietly told their troops to fade into the countryside and go home. The German command structure in the West had essentially disintegrated. Orders from higher headquarters often didn't arrive. When they did arrive, they were frequently obsolete or impossible to execute. Local commanders made their own decisions based on fragmentary information and personal judgment. 8th Corps, commanded by Major General Troy Middleton, swung north toward Kassel. Middleton was a steady, competent officer, not flashy like Patton, but reliable. His corps had fought through France and now drove deep into Germany with 3 infantry divisions and attached armour. The 80th Infantry Division, veterans who'd fought across France, got the job of taking Kassel. The division commander, Major General Horace McBride, was thorough and methodical. He didn't take unnecessary risks with his men's lives. Intelligence said Kassel was defended, but nobody knew by what or how many. Aerial reconnaissance showed destroyed buildings, rubble-choked streets, but no clear picture of German strength. The 80th Division's intelligence section estimated maybe 2,000 or 3,000 defenders, mostly second-line troops. That estimate would prove roughly accurate, though the actual number was higher. The Americans expected another quick fight. Surround the city, bring up artillery, pound the defenders until they surrendered. Take the city, move on, end the war. Standard procedure by this point in the campaign. Except Hitler had other ideas. In late March, from his bunker in Berlin, Adolf Hitler designated Kassel a fortress, a Festung. The order came down through Wehrmacht command channels. Kassel was to be held, no retreat, no surrender. Fight until the city is rubble and every defender is dead. The Festung concept had a logic to it, at least on paper. Designate key cities as fortresses, garrison them heavily, let the Allies besiege them while mobile forces maneuver in the field. The Allied advance would slow as they tied down divisions in urban fighting. The Wehrmacht would gain time to regroup, to bring up reserves, to organize counterattacks. It had worked in a few isolated cases. Brest, for example, held out for weeks, but usually the fortress cities just became death traps for their defenders. The problem? Kassel wasn't a fortress. It was a bombed-out industrial city with maybe 6,000 soldiers scraped together from training units, rear area personnel, and old men in Volkssturm armbands. No serious fortifications, no stockpiled ammunition or food for a prolonged siege, no strategic reserve to relieve a siege if it developed. Just another city that would be encircled, pounded by artillery, and captured or destroyed. The fortress order was meaningless except that it condemned the defenders to fight when they could have withdrawn or surrendered. Command fell to Major General Johannes Urkeben, a communications officer who'd been running training programs when the crisis hit. Urkeben was 51 years old, a career officer who'd spent most of the war in staff and training assignments. He had no combat command experience. He'd never led troops in battle. His expertise was in radio procedures, signal security, communications networks, perfectly competent in his field, completely unprepared for what was about to happen. Higher headquarters, itself in chaos, assigned him to organize the defense because he was senior officer present and someone had to do it. Urkeben set up his command post in a bunker complex on the eastern edge of the city and tried to organize something that resembled a coherent defense. He divided the city into sectors. He assigned units to defensive positions. He established supply dumps and aid stations. He did everything a competent officer would do. None of it would matter. His staff was improvised. Officers pulled from training commands, logistics units, replacement depots. Most had never worked together. Some had never met before being assigned to the defense headquarters. Communications were a nightmare. Radio sets didn't work properly. Telephone lines had been cut by bombing. Messengers on foot or bicycle carried orders that often arrived hours late or not at all. The core of the garrison consisted of the 15th Armoured Infantry Replacement and Training Battalion. These were trainers and trainees. Some were instructors who knew their jobs but had never commanded in combat, men in their 30s and 40s who'd spent the war teaching 18-year-olds how to fight from armoured half-tracks. They understood the theory, they'd never done it under fire. Others were kids halfway through basic training. 17-year-olds who'd been drafted 2 months earlier and taught to march, shoot, take orders. Now they were expected to hold a defensive position against American combined arms attacks. They had rifles, a few machine guns, some mortars, no armour, no real anti-tank weapons except short-range Panzerfausts, the German equivalent of the bazooka. Effective range, maybe 60 meters against a moving target. You had to let the tank get close, aim carefully, hope the rocket didn't misfire. One shot, then throw away the tube and run. The 15th Replacement Grenadier Regiment added more infantry, but the quality was worse. Overage reservists, wounded men deemed fit for limited duty, guys who should have been behind a desk or in a hospital, now given rifles and told to hold the line. Artillery support came from Luftwaffe flak batteries, 88mm guns positioned around the city to shoot down bombers. The crews had trained to engage ground targets, but never done it for real. They'd practiced the drills in peacetime exercises, lower the barrel, set the sights for direct fire, load armor-piercing rounds. Simple enough on paper, different when American tanks are shooting back and artillery is landing around your gun pit. Ammunition was limited. Each gun had maybe 200 rounds. That sounds like a lot until you start firing at moving targets at combat ranges. Miss rates are high, you burn through ammunition fast, and there was no resupply. The rounds in the ready magazines were all they'd get. Then there was the Volkssturm, Hitler's home guard militia, men between 45 and 60, given obsolete rifles and armbands, told to man roadblocks. Most had minimal training, some had none. They'd been assembled, issued weapons, given a brief explanation of how to load and fire, then marched to their positions. They wore civilian clothes. A few had helmets scrounged from who knows where. They were not soldiers, they were sacrifices. Everyone knew it except maybe them. On March 30th, the 8 Tiger IIs rolled south from Kassel toward Fritzlar, about 29 kilometers away. Their mission was simple: block the American advance from the south. The route took them through secondary roads because the main highways were cratered from bombing. Movement was slow. The Tigers consumed fuel at an alarming rate even on pavement. The column averaged maybe 20 kilometers per hour. The crews had just received the tanks days earlier. They barely knew how to operate them. The driver in each tank had maybe 10 hours behind the controls. The gunners had fired the main gun once or twice at stationary targets. The loaders understood the mechanics of ramming an 88mm shell into the breech, but had never done it under pressure. The commanders, mostly sergeants with some combat experience on other tank types, were learning the Tiger II on the job. Communication between vehicles was spotty because the radios didn't work right. The sets were installed and theoretically functional, but the crews hadn't been trained on proper radio procedure. Messages got garbled, call signs were confused, the company had no effective radio net, no infantry support came with them. The plan called for a company of armoured grenadiers to accompany the Tigers. The company never arrived. Either the orders didn't reach them, or they couldn't reach the departure point, or they got diverted to another crisis. The Tigers rolled out alone, no artillery liaison either, just 8 tanks and their teenage crews against whatever showed up on the road. What showed up was Combat Command A of the 4th Armoured Division, a unit that had fought from Normandy to the German border. These were veterans, men who'd landed in France in July 1944 and fought through the breakout, across France into Germany. They'd seen the Bulge, they'd crossed the Rhine, they knew their jobs. Their reconnaissance battalion, equipped with M5 Stuart light tanks and M8 armoured cars, was moving fast up the highway toward Fritzlar. They had no intelligence about German armour in the area. The last report of Tigers in this sector was weeks old. The Americans expected rearguard resistance, nothing serious. Maybe some roadblocks, maybe a few anti-tank guns, nothing that would stop a mechanized column. The Tigers were waiting in hull-down positions along a ridgeline overlooking the highway. The German company commander had positioned the tanks carefully. Good fields of fire across open ground. The ridgeline provided cover and concealment. From the hull-down position, only the turrets were exposed. The 88mm guns could engage targets at long range. Around 1400 hours, the American column came into view at about 1,000 meters. Led vehicles were M8 armored cars, 6-wheeled reconnaissance vehicles with 37mm guns and light armor. Behind them came the Stuarts. The column was moving at speed, maybe 40 kilometers per hour. The Tigers opened fire immediately. The first shots came almost simultaneously from 3 or 4 tanks. The range was point blank by Tiger II standards. The gunners could hardly miss. The first salvo destroyed 3 Stuart tanks and 1 armoured car. 88mm armour-piercing rounds punched through the thin armour like paper. The Stuarts, with maximum armour of 51mm, had 0 chance. The rounds went in one side and out the other, exploding inside and turning the vehicles into funeral pyres. Crews bailed out and ran. Some made it to cover. Others were cut down by machine gun fire from the Tigers. The American column stopped dead. Vehicles slammed on brakes. Drivers threw their machines into reverse. Radio calls went back to headquarters. Contact, contact, multiple enemy tanks taking fire. Tank destroyers moved up from positions further back in the column. M10s with 3-inch guns and M36s with 90mm guns. These were purpose-built tank killers, open-top vehicles with powerful guns designed to engage enemy armour at range. They deployed off the road, trying to find hull-down positions. A few rounds hit the Tiger's frontal armour at ranges between 1200 and 1500 metres. Nothing penetrated. The armour was too thick, the angle too steep. Rounds sparked off the glacis and turret front. Return fire from the Tigers destroyed 2 M10s and 1 M36. The 88mm gun was devastating at this range. One hit anywhere on the M10's thin armour would penetrate and detonate. One Sherman tried flanking through the woods east of the highway. The Tiger gunner spotted it at 1500 metres, traversed smoothly, fired once. The Sherman exploded, ammunition cooking off in a secondary blast. By 1600 hours, the Americans had pulled back beyond direct fire range and called in artillery. This was standard doctrine when encountering dug-in armour. Don't waste tanks trying to dig them out. Use artillery. 105mm howitzers from the division's supporting artillery battalions started dropping shells on the German positions. The first rounds fell short. Forward observers adjusted fire. Walk it closer. Up 50. Right 20. Within 30 minutes, high explosive shells were bursting among the Tiger positions. The tanks had no overhead cover, they were simply parked on a ridgeline with nothing but sky above. Shrapnel could damage optics, radios, external equipment. A lucky hit on the engine deck could knock out the whole vehicle. The German company commander, watching shells land closer with each salvo, made the correct tactical decision. Withdraw. No point sitting here getting pounded. The Tigers backed off the ridge carefully, commanders guiding drivers because visibility in reverse was terrible. They headed north toward Kassel, using back roads and farm tracks. One vehicle threw a track during the move. The left track came off the drive sprocket, probably due to excessive wear combined with rough handling by an inexperienced driver. The Tiger coasted to a halt, 69 tons of dead weight blocking the road. The crew worked frantically to repair it, but track repair on a Tiger II required specialized tools and several hours. They didn't have hours. The company commander made another correct decision. Abandon the vehicle. The crew pulled critical components, removable optics, machine guns, radios, maps. They set demolition charges in the fighting compartment and the engine bay. The explosions left the Tiger a burned-out hulk. The crew piled onto other Tigers, riding on the engine deck. The other 7 reached Kassel after dark, having used 40% of their main gun ammunition and fuel they couldn't replace. The engagement at Fritzlar had delayed the American advance by maybe 6 hours. 6 hours purchased at the cost of 1 Tiger abandoned and roughly 40 rounds of 88mm ammunition. American losses were 6 to 9 armoured vehicles destroyed. The tactical result was nothing. The strategic situation hadn't changed at all. Kassel was still going to be attacked. The garrison was still going to defend. The outcome was still predetermined, but for the teenage Tiger crews, it had been their first taste of combat. They'd fired their guns in anger. They'd destroyed enemy vehicles. They'd withdrawn under artillery fire. They'd lost a tank to mechanical failure, and now they waited. On April 1st, the 80th Infantry Division approached Kassel from the south and southwest. All 3 regiments, the 317th, 318th and 319th, moved into assault positions with attached tank and tank destroyer battalions. Standard combined arms organization. Each regiment had 3 battalions of infantry. Each battalion had 3 rifle companies and a heavy weapons company. Attached were tank companies with M4 Shermans and tank destroyer companies with M10s or M36. Artillery registered fire on suspected German positions. Forward observers moved up with the infantry, selecting targets, calling back coordinates. The artillery battalions, 105mm howitzers, positioned several kilometers to the rear, fired registration shots, single rounds at selected targets to confirm range and deflection. The observers watched where the rounds landed, made corrections, confirmed the data. Now the guns were ready. Engineers prepared to clear rubble and obstacles. Kassel's streets were choked with debris from years of bombing. Buildings had collapsed across roadways. Craters pitted the pavement. The engineers brought up bulldozers, explosives, bridging equipment. Medics set up aid stations in rear areas. The first contact came from an 88mm flak battery on high ground southwest of the city. The position had been carefully prepared. The guns sat in revetments. Earth walls built up to provide frontal protection. Ammunition was stacked in dugouts nearby. The crews had range cards showing distances to key terrain features. Around 1000 hours on April 1st, lead elements of the 319th Infantry came under fire moving up the main highway from the south. The American infantry was advancing in a column of companies, one company forward, two back. Attached tanks moved with the lead company. The formation moved cautiously. The 88s engaged at 1200 to 1800 meters, long range for direct fire against moving vehicles, but the German gun crews were well trained and the optics on the 88 were excellent. The first rounds were ranging shots, short, over corrections. The next salvo hit. High-velocity armor-piercing rounds punched through the M4 Shermans, supporting the infantry advance. 3 Shermans went up in flames in rapid succession, explosions booming across the fields. The American infantry hit the dirt and called for artillery. Radio calls went from the forward observer to the fire direction center. 3 minutes later, rounds were in the air. Counter-battery fire. American forward observers directed fire onto the German gun positions. They had the general location from observing muzzle flashes. They called for effect, multiple batteries firing simultaneously. 105mm and 155mm howitzers began systematically destroying the flak battery. Shells dropped into the gun pits at a rate of 1 every few seconds. The German gun crews, exposed in open pits with minimal overhead cover, took casualties immediately. The revetments provided frontal protection, but nothing against high-angle artillery fire. Shells dropped almost vertically. Men were cut down by shrapnel. Guns were damaged by near misses. Within 20 minutes, 4 of the 6 guns were knocked out. Crews dead or wounded. Guns destroyed or damaged beyond field repair. The surviving crews tried to withdraw. They hooked 2 guns to trucks and attempted to pull out under fire. American artillery caught them in the open. The trucks were destroyed. The guns were abandoned. The battery ceased to exist. The men who survived, perhaps a dozen out of 50, scattered into the woods. The 7 remaining Tiger IIs had been moved during the night to support the southern sector. Orders from Urkeben's headquarters directed them to positions in the suburbs and industrial ruins south of the Fulda River. The tanks took up hull-down positions using rubble and destroyed buildings for cover, but they had no infantry support. The plan called for combined arms. Infantry to protect the tanks from close assault, tanks to provide heavy firepower for the infantry. Neither worked without the other, but the infantry that was supposed to support the Tigers never arrived. The tanks operated in isolation, vulnerable to infantry close assault. As the 318th Infantry advanced into the western suburbs during April 1st and 2nd, they met sporadic fire from German training battalion personnel and Volkssturm. The resistance was uncoordinated. No central direction. Small groups held buildings and fired from windows until American firepower drove them out. Sometimes a dozen men would hold a building for hours. Sometimes a position would be abandoned at the first sign of American tanks. American casualties were light because the infantry worked methodically. Artillery and tank fire suppressed each building before infantry entered. If a building showed resistance, call for a tank. The Sherman would roll up, fire several high explosive rounds through the windows, then the infantry would clear the rubble. It was slow, but it minimized American losses. German casualties mounted steadily. Men killed by artillery, men killed by tank fire, men killed clearing buildings, men who surrendered when their ammunition ran out. The training battalion personnel, most of whom had never imagined they'd be in frontline combat, broke quickly when the situation became hopeless. On April 2nd, General Urkeben ordered a counterattack. The pressure on the southern perimeter was becoming unbearable. American forces were pushing deeper into the suburbs. The defensive line was collapsing. Something had to be done. The plan was thrown together in a few hours with forces that weren't ready. A battalion from the 15th Grenadier Regiment, maybe 400 men, would lead the attack, supported by whatever vehicles could be scraped together. About 15 half-tracks and the armour. The 7 Tiger IIs and maybe 5 or 6 Panzer IV medium tanks pulled from repair depots. The attack kicked off at dawn on April 2nd, pushing south from assembly areas in the eastern suburbs. The objective was to break through American positions along the Fulda River. Coordination between infantry and armour was terrible. No combined arms training, no rehearsals. The half-tracks, carrying grenadiers, moved ahead of the tanks. American observers spotted the movement almost immediately. Forward observers called artillery. Fire missions went to multiple batteries. Within minutes, shells were falling among the German column. The half-tracks, with armour no thicker than 14mm, were death traps under artillery fire. High explosive shells burst among them. Shrapnel tore through the thin steel. Vehicles brewed up. Others slewed to a halt. Infantry dismounted in chaos and tried to continue the attack on foot. Now they were exposed infantrymen crossing open ground under artillery fire. Men went down in clusters as shells landed among them. Officers tried to maintain order. Some officers went down. The attack began to lose cohesion before it had advanced 500 meters. The Tigers, moving through rubble-choked streets several hundred meters behind, advanced more slowly. Urban terrain is a nightmare for tank operations. Streets too narrow, rubble blocking routes, blind corners everywhere. Drivers crept forward at walking speed. Navigation through Kassel proved nearly impossible. The city had been bombed so heavily that landmarks were gone. Streets were buried under rubble. The tank commanders tried to orient using the sun and key terrain features. Some got lost immediately, others made wrong turns. Radios stopped working properly in the built-up areas. Buildings blocked signals. Communication degraded to near zero. The company lost all cohesion. Individual tanks operated on their own. One Tiger, commanded by a senior sergeant whose name doesn't appear in surviving records, somehow navigated correctly and broke through American forward positions. The tank reached the Fulda River crossing, a bridge that was damaged but passable. The Tiger took up a firing position and engaged American vehicles on the far bank. The 88mm gun spoke twice, destroying at least 2 tank destroyers at ranges under 1,000 meters. Then the Americans responded. Multiple tank destroyers, Shermans, anti-tank guns concentrated fire from different directions. The Tiger took hits from multiple angles. Most glanced off the thick frontal armor, but something hit the engine compartment from the side. Penetration. Fire started immediately. Flames spread rapidly. The crew attempted to evacuate. The commander came up through his hatch first. He was immediately shot. The gunner and loader bailed out and were captured. The driver and radio operator tried to get out through the bull hatches. The driver's hatch jammed. They were still inside when the ammunition detonated. The other Tigers, scattered through the city streets, encountered American defenses that had solidified overnight, tank destroyers in overwatch positions, anti-tank guns covering intersections, bazooka teams positioned in upper-story windows. One Tiger, advancing down a rubble-strewn avenue, came under fire from multiple directions. A bazooka team hit it in the engine compartment from above. The rocket penetrated and started a fire. The tank lurched to a halt. The crew bailed out and tried to escape on foot. Some made it back, others were captured or killed. Another Tiger took multiple hits to the tracks and running gear. High explosive shells from Shermans hammered the suspension until the left track broke and several road wheels were destroyed. The tank sat there, unable to move. The crew fired off their remaining ammunition, then set demolition charges and evacuated. American artillery hammered the German forces without mercy. High explosive shells burst among the exposed grenadier infantry. Men dove for cover. Others were cut down. White phosphorus rounds started fires. The grenadier battalion took terrible casualties and fell back in disorder. Unit cohesion broke down. The half-tracks that survived withdrew under cover of smoke. The counterattack achieved absolutely nothing except adding bodies to the count. By mid-afternoon on April 2nd, only 4 Tiger IIs remained operational. The other 4 were gone. 1 abandoned at Fritzlar, 3 destroyed in the counterattack. German infantry positions throughout the southern and western suburbs had collapsed. American forces controlled these areas and began pushing into the city centre. On April 3rd, The encirclement tightened, 3 American regiments converging from 3 directions. The 317th Infantry advanced from the north, the 318th pressed from the west. The 319th secured the south. American artillery kept up continuous fire. Forward observers called targets. Gun crews loaded and fired continuously. German defenders, increasingly fragmented, tried to hold individual buildings and street blocks, small groups, a dozen men, sometimes fewer, occupying a building or a block of ruins, fighting until overrun or until ammunition ran out. Volkssturm units ordered to man roadblocks found themselves bypassed or destroyed in place. The Americans simply went around strongpoints when possible. Training battalion personnel surrendered when their positions became untenable. Hands up, white flags, walking forward into captivity. Communication between defensive sectors broke down completely. Urquiben's headquarters issued orders that never reached anyone. Radio nets were jammed, telephone lines had been cut, messengers were killed or captured. Company and platoon leaders made their own decisions, usually to fall back toward the city center. The 4 surviving Tiger IIs got orders to withdraw eastward and establish a final defensive line protecting approaches to Urquiben's command bunker. The tanks moved during the night of April 2nd to 3rd. One commander, Sergeant Heinz Wilms, positioned his tank to cover the eastern highway exit from Kassel. The spot Wilms chose offered excellent fields of fire across open ground. The highway ran straight for several hundred meters. Any vehicle approaching would be silhouetted against the sky. Wilms positioned his Tiger hull down behind rubble from a destroyed factory. His crew loaded armor-piercing rounds. They waited. American forces approaching from the west on April 3rd afternoon hit this position hard. Lead elements of the 318th Infantry advancing along the highway came under fire without warning. An M4 Sherman at the head of the column was destroyed at roughly 1,000 meters. The 88mm round hit the turret, penetrated, detonated the ammunition. The turret blew off. The crew died instantly. A second Sherman trying to maneuver got hit and caught fire. Infantry accompanying the tanks went to ground. Officers tried to assess the situation. The Tiger dominated the approach. The Americans pulled back and called for artillery. But before the artillery could arrive, a local civilian approached American officers with information. He knew Kassel. He could show them a route to get behind the Tiger. The American company commander listened and sent a platoon forward with the civilian as a guide. The movement took over an hour, crawling through rubble, moving through basements. The Tiger crew, focused on the western approach, didn't observe the infiltration. The assault came at dusk on April 3rd. American infantrymen reached positions within 50 meters of the Tiger's rear. 2 bazooka teams set up simultaneously. On signal, they fired. Both rockets hit the engine deck. The explosions ruptured fuel lines and started fires. The Maybach engine ignited. Flames spread rapidly. The crew knew they had seconds. Sergeant Wilms came up through his hatch first. He was immediately shot, cut down by rifle fire. Multiple bullets hit him. He fell back into the tank. The gunner and loader came out anyway. They exited through the loader's hatch, jumped off the tank, and were immediately covered by American infantry. Hands up, surrender. The driver and radio operator in the hull tried to escape through their own hatches. The driver's hatch was difficult to operate. They struggled with it. They were still inside when the main gun ammunition detonated. The explosion was massive, 88mm rounds cooking off one after another. The blast gutted the fighting compartment. The turret lifted and settled back at an angle. When American troops approached later, they found the hull crew's bodies burned beyond recognition. The destruction of Wilms's Tiger eliminated the last significant German armor actively engaging American forces. The 3 remaining Tiger IIs, parked elsewhere in the city, were low on fuel and ammunition. Their commanders made the decision to abandon the vehicles during the night of April 3rd to 4th, standard procedure: remove optical equipment, destroy the radios, remove machine guns if possible, set demolition charges. Some crews followed procedure, others just ran. The Tigers sat there in the streets, hulks blocking intersections. By the morning of April 4th, American forces had completely encircled Kassel. Every route out was controlled by 81st Division units. German forces remaining inside maybe totaled 1,500 combat-capable personnel. Ammunition stocks were critically low. Food supplies had been exhausted. Water came from broken pipes. Medical facilities had collapsed. The wounded lay untreated in cellars, dying from infections. blood loss, shock. The fighting on April 4th devolved into systematic building-to-building clearance. American infantry advanced block by block. Reconnaissance first. Identify which buildings are occupied. Then firepower. Tanks and tank destroyers blast the buildings. Then infantry enters and clears what's left. M16, multiple gun motor carriages, proved particularly effective. These were half-tracks mounting 450 caliber heavy machine guns. The 4 guns could fire together at 2,000 rounds per minute. The effect against buildings was devastating. The heavy bullets tore through brick walls. They killed defenders behind cover. They suppressed return fire. American infantry followed, entering buildings cautiously, clearing room by room. Grenades first. Then enter and shoot anything that moves. German casualties mounted throughout the day. Men killed by tank fire, artillery, small arms. Men wounded who would receive no treatment. Men who surrendered. At 0900 hours on April 4th, American infantry surrounded Urkeben's command bunker. The position was in an industrial district, a reinforced concrete structure built as an air raid shelter. Heavy construction, thick walls, it could probably have resisted direct assault for hours. But what was the point? American tanks moved into positions around the bunker. Several Shermans and at least one self-propelled gun fired at the bunker. Tank fire destroyed external antennas. The bunker was isolated, surrounded. Urkeben, inside with his surviving staff, maybe 20 men, recognized the situation was hopeless. The city had fallen. His forces had been destroyed. Further resistance would just result in more deaths. He consulted with his officers. Some argued for continued resistance. Others argued for surrender. Urkeben made the decision to surrender. He sent an officer forward under a white flag to negotiate. The major approached American lines carefully. An infantry captain met him. The conversation was brief. The American response was unambiguous. Unconditional surrender, no negotiation, no terms except immediate cessation of resistance and treatment of prisoners according to Geneva Convention. The major carried this response back. Urkeben, after discussing the matter with his staff for perhaps 15 minutes, accepted. Around 1200 hours, noon on April 4th, 1945, he emerged from the bunker with his staff, hands visible, unarmed. He formally surrendered himself and the city to representatives of the 81st Infantry Division. German troops throughout the city began laying down weapons. Groups emerged from cellars, from ruined buildings, hands raised, walking forward slowly. American soldiers disarmed them, searched them, directed them to assembly points. The prisoners looked terrible, filthy, exhausted, many wounded, most hollow-eyed from days without proper food or sleep. Total German prisoners numbered approximately 1,325 military personnel. This figure likely includes only those captured on April 4th. It doesn't count men who died, men who escaped, men who blended into the civilian population. The actual German strength at the start was probably 4,000 to 5,000. The battle for Kassel lasted 5 days from March 30th to April 4th. American casualties for the 80th Division totaled 23 killed, 114 wounded, 6 missing. These figures might be incomplete. The Americans had overwhelming advantages. They could afford to fight carefully. For George Patton, Kassel was not a triumph to dwell on. It was confirmation. His army had smashed through Germany's industrial heartland, broken organized resistance, and continued moving at a pace the enemy could no longer match. The appearance of factory-fresh Tiger IIs did not change his assessment. They were impressive machines, but they arrived too late, in too few numbers, and without the infrastructure needed to support them. Patton's response was the same as it had been since the Rhine crossing: keep moving. Kassel was secured, prisoners were collected, and the Third Army rolled east without pause. There would be no consolidation, no pause for admiration of captured tanks. Speed remained the priority. In the days that followed, Patton's columns pushed toward Fulda, Eisenach, and the Thuringian Basin, overrunning airfields, supply depots, and shattered German formations. Organized resistance collapsed rapidly. Units surrendered by the thousands. Others simply disintegrated. By mid-April, the Third Army was deep in central Germany, linking up with First Army units and driving toward the Elbe. Kassel became just another point on the map, another city bypassed in a campaign defined not by set-piece battles, but by relentless momentum. For the men who fought there, Kassel was the end. For Patton, it was only another mile marker on the road east, and proof that even Germany's most powerful weapons could no longer slow the advance. And that brings this video to a close. I hope you found it interesting and learned something new. If you enjoyed it, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. It genuinely helps the channel grow, and I appreciate every one of you who supports the work I do here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care, and goodbye for now.